In our focus today on debit and credit cards, it's important to start off with, well, what does a debit and credit card look like? And so we want to make sure that we have a good understanding of what they look like first before talking about anything else. And most of us have seen debit and credit cards. And so we see a couple of examples here. Here's one that somebody's holding in their hand. Here's another one somebody's holding in their hand. So we can get an idea of the size of them. They're small cards, usually made out of plastic, sometimes metal. And we see that there's a number on them. Most of the time it's a 16-digit number with a few exceptions. There looks like there's a Visa or MasterCard logo, or it could be a Discover or American Express. The name of the card holder is on there and a card expiration date. So on the back of the card, there's a magnetic strip and there's usually a signature block. We also see that a lot of the cards have the chip. And so the chip is very common on most cards these days, on debit cards and credit cards. So we can see what a credit card looks like. Let's look at a debit card. And what we notice is that a debit card looks very, very similar. It's the same size, same shape. It's made out of the same materials as well, so usually either plastic or metal or something similar. I do see Visa, MasterCard logos on these. I do see a 16-digit number on most of these. I see the chip. So they look very similar. Here we go. Here's the magnetic strip that we have as well. And so at first glance, it might be kind of difficult to tell the difference between a debit and credit card. And so some people might think that they're the same thing. And in fact, they're not. Now, a debit card with a Visa or MasterCard logo can be used as a credit card, meaning that the machinery that's processing it can process it as a credit card, but the way that it works with your bank and the way that the card actually works is very different. And we'll talk about that today during our lesson. But the one thing that I do notice that's on every single one of these debit cards that's not on the credit cards, and let's see if you notice it. And the one thing that we can always tell if it's a debit card, because if you notice, it has the word debit on every single card. So if it's a debit card, it says debit card or debit right on it. Starting off today's lesson here, we have debit card, what does it look like? And credit card, what does it look like? Well, both of them look very similar. They're small cards. They're made out of plastic. So I'm going to write that on both. Sometimes they're made out of metal, but I'm just going to write plastic. They have the owner's name, magnetic strip, and there's a credit card number or debit card number. So they look very similar. On the back, there's a phone number to call if the card is lost or stolen, and that's a really important thing. So if your card is ever lost or stolen, you do need to report it right away, whether it's a debit card or a credit card, because you don't want other people using it. Credit cards are really, really easy to use. Somebody just has to swipe it and use it. Debit card does require one extra step that makes them a little bit safer, but not a whole lot. And so we'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, the one thing that a debit card has that a credit card does not have is the word debit or debit card printed on the card. How does it work? Well, a debit card, the way a debit card works is every time you make a purchase, it takes the money from your bank account. So your debit card, every time I swipe my debit card, it's removing money directly from my bank account. So if I have money in my bank account, I'm able to use my debit card. If I don't have money in my bank account, then I'm unable to use my debit card in most cases. A credit card works a little bit differently. When I use a credit card, when I buy something on a credit card, I'm actually borrowing money. So I'm borrowing money from a bank. It's not taking it directly out of my account. So if I swipe my Visa card at HEB for, say, $50, then my Chase checking account is still the same. It doesn't affect that account at all. So it doesn't come out of my money, then my Visa card is paying. So the Visa company or whatever bank that they're partnering with is paying HEB for that purchase, that transaction. And so what actually ends up happening is then what they're going to do is they're going to charge an interest fee. They're going to charge extra money to me because I borrowed money from them. And then when I pay it back, so I get to pay it later on, then when I pay Visa for that transaction, I'm not going to pay the $50 I spent. I'm actually going to pay a little bit more because I do have to pay that interest fee. And so speaking of fees, that takes us to the next box. For the debit card, most of the time there's not fees for debit cards. Now, years ago, there used to be fees for debit. It was pretty common, but most of the time it's not very common these days. So the only time that you are going to see a fee for a debit card is if you spend more than what's in your account. So hefty fee, meaning there's going to be a pretty big fee if you spend more than what's in your account. Now for a credit card, we just talked about that. So a credit card, there is a fee which is called an interest fee. And so the interest fee is money that you're going to pay on money that you borrow. And so if I swipe my credit card at HEB for $50, when I go to pay that bill, I have to pay the $50 plus a little bit more, which is interest. Also, some credit cards, not all, but some also have a yearly fee as well. There's usually fees for credit cards. Now, are there any limitations to how much you can spend? Now, on the debit side, of course there is. The limitations to what you can spend for debit card is how much is in your bank account. So you cannot spend more than what's in your bank account. For a credit card, when we're talking about limitations, there is a limitation, even though it's money that I'm borrowing, so I'm not paying my own money or using my own money at that moment that I buy something, I do have a limit. That limit is called a credit limit. Usually when you turn 18, you start getting these credit card offers in the mail. So some of you that have older siblings may be familiar with this, but you start getting these credit card offers in the mail, and they usually start you off with a pretty low credit limit. They'll say, we're going to give you maybe a $500 credit limit. So that means you can go to the store, you can buy whatever you want, up to $500, and then you have to pay that back with interest. If you show that you're responsible, you're paying your things on time, paying your interest on time, and paying off your balances as agreed upon, then what they'll do is they'll go ahead and raise your credit limit and start letting you spend a little more. Maybe they'll raise it to, say, $700 and then $800 and then up to $1,000 and so on. What other things do you know about these cards? And so usually I like having this conversation in class so I can have student feedback in real time. But a couple of important things that we need to know. So with debit cards, because it's coming out of your bank account as you spend it, it's very, very important to keep up with it. So in the next lesson, we'll talk about balancing our checkbook. And so it's important that you know how to do that and you keep track of what you spend so you don't spend more than what's in your account because you don't want to have to pay those fees. Another thing is with a debit card, you have what's called a PIN number. And so when you make a purchase with a debit card or make a debit purchase, you have to have a PIN number. And usually a PIN number is a 4-digit number. And it does actually stand for something. It's not just a weird name that somebody just picked one day. It actually stands for Personal Identification Number. So your PIN is your personal identification number. You put that number in when you want to make a debit purchase. So I can give somebody my debit card. If they know my PIN number, they can go use that card. But credit does not use that PIN number. So credit works a little bit differently. And so other things you want to know about these cards for credit, you definitely need to keep track of your purchases as well. You don't want to overspend. You don't want to hit your credit limit and then you can't spend any more money. And then you have to pay back all this money with interest. So you do want to keep up with what it is. You want to be responsible with credit cards. You want to pay them on time. And you want to try not to be spending so much money on interest that you just have a hard time getting out of debt. So you want to take care and be responsible with this type of card as well.